let me tell you about the surreal meeting that I was at COP28, which was last year's climate conference. And there was a session called Security and Climate Change. So I thought I would go. And there were some NATO officials there at the front table. I thought it was going to be about how we can't cooperate if we're at war, how war is the opposite of sustainable development and so forth. It was actually, and I'm not, I'm not kidding you, it was actually these officials talking about how they're going to make the tanks and the planes with green technology, and how we're going to have solar powered tanks so that we can kill people without carbon emissions and so forth. I made some rather nasty comments and left the room. But yes, there are, by the way, significant direct effects of war on the environment. But I think the real cost of war is that it completely deflects attention, political capital, and the vital cooperation needed to address issues like climate change. It directs them towards killing and destruction. And we don't even get to the problem solving part. We barely speak to China these days, for example. We don't speak at all to Russia. How are we going to solve global climate change if we're not even talking to each other? And believe me, we're not. So that is really the harm. We say, by the way, the United States, because it's almost like school children, how naive and simplistic it is. Yes, we have our tensions with China, but we will continue to cooperate on climate change. Please give me a break. If they really understood anything, they would understand we cannot cooperate with the hostility, the sanctions, the saber rattling, the planning for war over Taiwan, and the idea of the United States, oh, we'll cooperate on this one, but we won't cooperate on this one, is puerile. It's juvenile. It doesn't work. I see it with my own eyes. I know these diplomats. You cannot parse things this way. Cooperation requires trust. It requires hard work. It requires extensive diplomacy. And with the kind of hostility that we have right now, it's not present.
So it's almost like we're greenwashing war, but not addressing any of the actual
Yes.
substantive, deep-rooted environmental.
And let me just say on the environmental side, in a nutshell, we're at 40 million tons of CO2 emitted per year. Basically, the emissions have, I think, roughly doubled since 1992. I actually have to go back and check because I don't remember exactly the baseline at the time of the signing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But I know that the emissions have continued to rise basically year after year. We haven't even stabilized the level of emissions, but to stabilize the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we have to get to zero emissions. But the emissions are still rising year to year. So we're not even close. We haven't even reached the turning point of the emissions flow, much less shown a serious intention to get to zero, which is what we need for CO2 concentrations to stabilize. So this is very late in the day. This year, the temperature already reached 1.5 degrees C above the pre-industrial level. That was the limit we said we will avoid. Partly it reached that because it was an El Nino year in the Pacific, so there was a interannual temporary jump. It's not 1.5 on long-term trend yet, but it will be very soon. So the environmental crises, the triple crises of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and mega pollution are continuing apace. And in our country, not only do we have the wars, but we also have a political system still pretty much dominated by big oil and big coal. It hasn't really changed. It's corrupt, and it's bad.
I've got 9, 10, 11, 12 messages. So here's again, I'm going to try to focus on students. How could international law instruments such as the UN or the ICJ, or for that matter, the ICC, help resolve some of these international issues? What's the state of
Yeah,
international?
the ICJ has ruled on the illegality of Israel's occupation, and it just did that. It is likely to rule that Israel is in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. It has not done that yet. It's made some interim rulings that there are reasons to believe this is the case. Believe me, the lobbying and pressure on this is extraordinary. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor Khan, signaled a couple of months ago now that he was calling for an indictment of Netanyahu and other senior Israeli leaders. And that is much deserved. But then he faced a deluge the court faced a deluge of protest and pressure from the US and the UK, and that indictment has not been handed down yet. And this is clearly political. You know, indicting an African leader, no problem. Indicting an ally of the United States, well, you face the wrath and geopolitical pressure of the US. But I'm very much hoping that the ICC follows through, and very much bemoaning the kind of intense geopolitical and lobbying pressure that the United States can impose on the court. Will it matter? Well, the US acts with impunity. It does not follow the decisions of international bodies. But its violation will be realized and understood by all the rest of the world. And that, I believe, is pressure and leverage. The United States should be isolated for blocking peace in the Middle East. It does not only deserves it, it's what is needed to help the public in the United States understand that world opinion is on the side of peace and on the side of a two-state solution, and that the United States is really the sole obstacle to that. As I've explained, I don't regard Israel as an obstacle to the two-state solution because I think it's not Israel's right to interfere in Palestine's self-determination. So I think that the world could go ahead justly and practically with creating the Palestinian state in a safe way as a UN member state, if it chooses to do so.
Thanks. Here's one from one of my students. The mindset of war is the business of war instead of peace. And if that doesn't change, what do you believe the state of the world will be in the future? I think we all feel dire about that.
Yes, you know, I think that the US approach to war is not universal. So one idea is, well, the US behaves just like every major power behaves. And one of my good friends and someone I admire very much, Professor John Mearsheimer at University of Chicago, maintains the position that he calls offensive realism, which is that it is by nature the fact that great powers struggle with each other and that we're trapped in that struggle because they're fighting for survival, they're fearful of survival, and that leads them to conflict. And he knows that that's extremely dangerous, so he calls it the tragedy of great power politics. I don't share his view entirely. I think he describes very well the American mindset, but I don't think he describes the mindset of other countries. I do not believe, really, that China is itching for war. And based on my several time per year visits to China, my discussions with Chinese leaders and Chinese scholars, I think they have absolutely no desire to meddle in American affairs, to create pressures with the US, but China does not want the United States to divide China by trying to pry off Taiwan. China had that experience in the 19th century. It actually lost Taiwan, which was part of the Qing dynasty, to Japan, which conquered China, won a major war in 1895, and China doesn't want to have it happen again. So this is, in my view, the real context that the US has this war mentality. It behaves as if it's under threat. But what is the threat? China could not possibly invade the United States. It's not even possible. China could destroy the United States with nuclear arms, as we could destroy China, as we could end the world. But that's a different matter. That's a reason for prudence, not a reason to believe that China is going to conquer the United States. So we need realism, not realism of continued conflict, but actually realism of the relative safety of the major powers, but for the risk of nuclear war, and then direct our attention to lowering, and I would say to zero, the risk of nuclear war. And that, to my mind, is the right kind of policy to pursue.
Here's a question back to the Middle East about, but it could apply elsewhere. If the US clearly can't be an honest broker in the Middle East, since it's the sponsor of the opposite, who could play that role, right? Could it be, countries
Yes.
like Norway, which have, but,
Now,
where's there some hope?
Yeah, the only, first, it's interesting. What do the different parts of the world say about the Palestine-Israel crisis? First, the Arab countries and Iran are very explicit, and they've made clear statements back in November last year at a summit in Riyadh, and then in April this year at an Arab League meeting in Bahrain, that they support the two-state solution. This is important, everybody, because it means that the general claim of Israel, that they have no one to talk to, that they face implacable foes and so forth, is a propaganda lie. It's not a reality. The Arab and Islamic countries have said, we want peace. We want normal relations with Israel when there are two states. So this is, this is really important. Then there are the other major powers, Russia, China, India, which is also a major power, but not in the sense of being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. There is no difference in principle between the US, China, and Russia on the Middle East issues. Everyone claims to want peace. Everyone claims to support the two-state solution. This is not a divide between the major powers. That's a good thing. So what's stopping peace? The United States is stopping peace. Why is the US stopping peace? Because it's siding unconditionally with Israel. Why is it siding unconditionally with Israel? Well, that's a question mark because it's not in American interest, but probably the Israel lobby is the best single explanation of that phenomenon. Why did such an absolutely disreputable, violent, murderous leader like Netanyahu get 58 standing ovations in the US Congress? Probably because those congressmen giving the standing ovations are on the payroll of AIPAC and others. I mean payroll in the sense of, I should be clear, receiving campaign contributions from AIPAC and related organizations. So this is really the problem. So who could be an honest broker? Just about anybody else, but I would say China, India, Russia, Brazil, the so-called BRICS countries could play a very big role. The Arab and Islamic states will confirm their desire for peace. The United States needs to understand it's becoming more and more isolated or completely isolated and completely estranged from US public opinion, which is aghast at what's happening, especially young people, but not only young people.
Here's one from political science student who says, if it's not on us when it comes to foreign policy blunders, what do we do? And certainly we can see some of the reactions in the protests that have spread throughout the country, including here at Hofstra. And where is there the hope for change?
Well, first of all, I'm extremely proud of students all over the country for standing up for justice for the Palestinians, knowing the difference of genocide, which is what's happening, and legitimate defense, which is not what is happening. And the students have been on the right side of this issue. And unfortunately, administrations across the country, including at Columbia, called the police instead of absolutely expressing admiration for the students' sense of justice. I would like the universities to do exactly what we're doing right now, by the way, so thank you, Hofstra, but I don't think Columbia does it, and that is to have opportunities to learn, to discuss, and to do what we really do best at universities, which is explore issues, look at it from various sides, discuss, debate, and understand the weight of the evidence and the logic of the situation. So that's what we should have done. Instead, they called the police on students at Columbia. And this is absolutely unacceptable. So what should the American people do? First, we're supposed to have a democracy. Boy, it doesn't feel like it, does it? We happen to have a president that I don't know if he's functional anymore. We don't really know because he's kept from view. He's kept from the American people. He doesn't communicate. So we don't really even know what the situation is. But in general, our presidents don't talk to us. Oh, they shout as the helicopter blades are swirling in the back. Want no more questions. And then they turn their backs to the reporters and they walk away. I was in Mexico last week, and President Lopez Obrador speaks for 2 hours every day in the morning from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. in an open press conference, no notes. He just meets the reporters that show up and he talks about the national issues for 2 hours. Really impressive, by the way. And he's got very big support, which is, I think, testimony to the fact that the public wants a politician connected with them, supposedly listening to us. Honestly, they're not listening to us at all. And they make war and peace decisions or nuclear war decisions without, not only without considering the consequences, but without even telling us what's involved. I remember in the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm an old guy, you know, so I remember 1962. And I remember watching alongside my terrified parents, watching President John F. Kennedy give a speech to the American people about what had happened, what the issues were, what the dangers are, what the administration's response is. It was very, very fraught, very dangerous. Kennedy saved the world together with his counterpart Nikita Khrushchev by not shooting. but instead trying to find a peaceful resolution, which they did succeed in doing. But we had a president then who spoke to the people. Maybe we will again. I don't know. It's not very encouraging, this whole situation. But I worry that we're a bit like the Roman Empire at this point, which kept the formal trappings of the Senate even after it fell into basically imperial rule by the emperor in 27 BC, when Augustus became the first emperor. The Senate was still there in form, but it was the emperor who called the shots. Right now, as I said, the shots are called by a few people in the military-industrial complex, not by the broad public. So we should fight to get our country back. The first order of business is for the public to know what's going on. That requires transparency and honesty. We have a complete, pervasive secrecy regime in the United States. Millions and millions of pages classified, every major issue classified. Well, how can you have a democracy if everything's secret? We don't in that sense. We have it in name, but not in function.
Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask my colleague, Paul Fritz, for comment or questions. Paul is a political science professor and is also the head of our Institute for Peace Studies. By the way, we have Peace Studies minor and a civic engagement minor for students out there who want.
By the way, this is so wonderful. Peace Studies, it's so unusual, and it's exactly what we need. And I'd like to ask the School of Peace Studies a question, if somebody could send me some references afterwards, because I'm really serious about my question. Does the US play peace games, not just war games? Mm-hmm. Have there been peace games where maybe diplomats and generals play on trying to resolve issues with China or Russia? Instead of asking how to win the war, do they actually play simulation games on how to win the peace? And if they don't do that, can we devise that? Yes. So that we could have peace games, but in a serious way, because you have to learn diplomacy, you have to learn negotiation. You have to be told at the end, you know, you should not have fired that shot, or that nuclear war was not necessary. Here was the path to peace, and you missed it. And this is what I would like people to learn. But I don't know if they're learning that. So it's a question for you. If somebody could come back with some references for me, I'm eager to learn.
Challenge accepted. We will.
Great.
Great. Paul, did you want to add something?
Well, I have many questions actually, but let me first say, Dr. Sachs, thank you for giving your time to hear. Regarding your last question, I don't know if there are peace games, but it is an interesting idea.
Good. If you'd like to follow up, since you're the School
Sure.
of Peace, I would really like to.
I will see.
Okay, good.
Though my questions for you, I'm one, let me say, I'm as dedicated to peace as anybody, but I study war.
Yeah.
Right. As an oncologist studies cancer.
Yep.
Right. To understand the causes. And what strikes me with your framing with a lot of this, and I'll just be upfront, I disagree with some of the framing you've put.
Yep.
I want to focus on the Ukraine war going on. And I'm sure you've gotten this question in perspective many times, but I'd like to hear your response. Your explanation really just is assuming defensive motivations by all actors except the United States.
Yes.
And I don't, let me say I think that there's a lot of research to suggest that that's not the case. It's not that Russia is a uniquely aggressive actor, but in fact, a declining state that is having declining status. We know very well from political science literature that they are more aggressive than other states. My own research suggests states that have lost wars, if you consider a Cold War a type of loss, tend to be very aggressive as well and try to reclaim their lost territories. And, sort of that's, I guess, the intentions in one part. The intentions other place that I would come to, and this goes back to your really nice quote that I tell all of my students from Clausewitz, Wars, Politics by Other Means. But Jeffrey Blaney also in his classic book from 1973 said that war takes two essentially, right? And he's built this whole bargaining literature. From that, this bargaining literature of war came. So, we've got the intentions question, but then we've got the agency question too. And the agency in your explanation is all residing within the United States. And that Russia is simply reacting to this. And I would ask sort of, where's the agency for Ukraine in deciding to potentially be part of wanting to be, at least with the regime since 2014, wanting to be part of NATO, but also agency of Poland and Hungary in the 1990s, and today Finland that joined NATO. And I would suggest that they did this. Nobody was forced to do this, of course. In fact, you can look back at Lithuania in 1991, as soon as the Soviet Union was breaking up. Lithuania symbolically applied for NATO membership as soon as it possibly could. There was a great desire by Eastern European countries to gain some sort of protection from, presumably, fear of Russian domination.
Yes.
So what I would like you to is sort of to, if you could take these perspectives and put it and juxtapose it to your explanation, sort of where it's mainly on the United States causing this. So if I could hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. First of all, I have no doubt that I know personally, of course, Poland wanted to join NATO, the Baltic states wanted to join NATO. I just would have said no. And Mexico may want someday to have a military treaty with China to establish Chinese bases because Mexico feels threatened by the United States. And I would say, hell no, no way. No way China's going to put military bases on the Rio Grande. And that would be America's position. It's been the position of the United States since 1823, the enunciation of the Monroe Doctrine. And actually, the Monroe Doctrine is very interesting when you read it because it says to Europe, you stay out of America and we will stay out of your problems. So it's a reciprocal declaration. It's not a unilateral declaration. It's a reciprocal declaration. And that's what the United States should do, which is you stay out of our hemisphere, we'll stay out of your hemisphere. This is the first point, which I absolutely believe. Second, I was there in 1989, 1990, 1991, and through the 1990s. Russia was not an aggressor, period. Russia was weak. It was looking for help. I sat across from Boris Yeltsin, and I know what was the intention of Russia. We want to get away from 75 years of communism. What a mess. We're buried in debt. We've got a rusted economy. We want good, normal relations with the U.S. Absolutely. And what was the U.S. position? Well, in February 1990, it was, we will not take advantage of you. NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. And for everyone interested, just look at the National Security Archives of George Washington University, and you can read all the documents, all the statements, all the lies that the United States told. And the U.S. did not want peace. Cheney wanted dominance. And that was the plan of Cheney and Wolfowitz starting in 1992. And we know that. That was the new national defense doctrine that they prepared. And it became embarrassing because it was so aggressive in 1992 that it had to be edited and been hidden from view. Now we know from historians that in 1994 already, Clinton agreed on NATO enlargement. And by the way, not just to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, but to Ukraine. And we know in 1997 from Brzezinski's article on a strategy for Eurasia in the Foreign Affairs Journal, he laid out the most aggressive strategy. And the whole idea was clear, that he made clear in the global chessboard, that basically, a la Mackinder, he who controls Ukraine controls Eurasia. He who controls Eurasia controls the world. This was an anti-Russian strategist talking that we need to make sure that Russia remains a second-rate power. There wasn't one bit of Russian aggression anywhere in the 1990s. There was NATO expansion. There was the bombing of Serbia for 78 days. There was all this blather about the sacred borders, and then the United States breaks Serbia in two and puts Bondesteel NATO base in Kosovo after breaking Kosovo apart. Then comes the next spate of wars: Afghanistan 2001, Iraq 2003, the unilateral US withdrawal from ABM in 2002, and 7 more countries in NATO enlargement in 2004. You know, Russia couldn't even catch its breath. And by the way, then we had our esteemed leadership, the classic names of the US neocons making the Committee for Chechnya. You know, if you look at that Committee for Chechnya, it's the gold-plated neocons. Do you think they even knew where Chechnya was on the map? Do you think they gave a damn about Chechnya? Of course not. They were out to break up Russia. And they say it, by the way, decolonize Russia. Russia's next. Soviet Union collapsed, Russia will collapse. This was hostility. I say it's basically analogous. You're in a prisoner's dilemma. Both sides are playing the defect. Then comes along Gorbachev and says, we'll play cooperative. And Baker runs up and says, okay, we'll play cooperative too. And then Russia plays cooperative, and the United States says, oh, no, we're going to play defect. And that's how they played the 1990s. Russia was not the aggressor. I watched it with my own eyes, day by day. The United States could not take peace for an answer. And by the way, Putin kept saying, please stop already. And in the 2007 Munich Security Conference, he said, look, you've already expanded NATO 10 times to the east. Stop now. Do not go further. And then, of course, my colleague Victoria Nuland she's the NATO ambassador then. She and Bush Jr. lead the call for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia at the Bucharest summit in 2008. That was not a defensive action. That was an offensive action. Absolutely offensive. And our current CIA director, William Burns, wrote a famous memo in early 2008 explaining to Condoleezza Rice, it could not be more neuralgic to Russia what we're doing. We knew what we were doing, but these people don't give a damn. They know that the United States should be able to do whatever it wants. So this was not us being defensive, and it didn't take 2 to make a war. It took 1 to keep pressing until we went over the edge. And we went over the edge February 22nd, 2014, when the United States participated in the Maidan coup. And that was a coup. That was a violent takeover of the government. And Victoria Nuland was absolutely the US point person for that. And if you have any doubts, I was told face to face, standing in the Maidan, how much US, I won't go into more details, paid for the Maidan. Well, God, we should not be paying for an insurrection. And we would not like it if we discovered that China had funded January 6th, 2021. We just would not like that at all. We funded the Maidan. I was told that one 50,000, that one 5,000, that one 10,000. So my answer to the question is, this is a clear case where this is really the prisoner's dilemma, where we said we would cooperate mutually, and then we cheated. And the other side kept saying, no, come on, come back to cooperation, come back to cooperation. And finally, Putin decided, not in 2000, not in 1999, not in 2001, not in 2004, not in 2007, but in 2014, okay, we're done. Now we go back to defect. So we go back to the non-cooperative game. It took him 15 years to reach that conclusion. That's my interpretation of the events.